Most people think life changes when money arrives, when circumstances finally cooperate, or when something out there improves. But what if the real shift happens long before any visible proof shows up? What if the moment your consciousness changes, your life has already transformed, quietly, invisibly, and inevitably? Think about how often you've heard phrases like, "This is just how life is," or "People like us don't get ahead." Those words didn't come from logic, they came from a state of being. Neville Goddard warned that until you change consciousness, you keep reenacting the same story, just with different characters and settings. That's why consciousness creates reality, not the other way around. Here's the paradox that feels uncomfortable at first. Trying harder doesn't fix a life built from the wrong state. You can work, pray, visualize, and hustle, but if the inner identity stays the same, the results recycle. That's where the law of assumption, explained through lived experience, becomes confronting and freeing at the same time. Neville Goddard taught that the world is not reacting to your effort, but to your assumption of who you are. When you shift your state, reality has no choice but to rearrange itself. This is why change consciousness, Neville Goddard emphasized, isn't motivational talk. It's a structural law of life. Most people are wishing, hoping, and waiting, while believing they're being practical. Yet the wish-fulfilled Neville method asks something radically different: to live from the end, to feel it real now, before logic approves it. And that's where fear usually kicks in, because it challenges everything you were taught about control and safety. This conversation isn't about positive thinking or pretending. It's about understanding how a imaginação cria a realidade, and why sentir é o segredo has nothing to do with forcing emotions. It's about learning to viver no fim so naturally that the old struggle dissolves without a fight. As this unfolds, something subtle starts to happen. You stop chasing outcomes and begin to notice how your perception shifts first. And once that shift begins, it becomes impossible not to question what truly needs to change next. Life doesn't transform because circumstances suddenly improve. It transforms when consciousness quietly moves into a new state of being. A mentor would often say that people wait for permission from the outside world before allowing themselves to feel different inside. But Neville Goddard pointed out that this order is backwards. Reality rearranges itself only after the inner shift has already happened. Until then, circumstances are just mirrors repeating the same message. Think about how someone can win more money and still feel poor, or enter a new relationship and feel just as insecure. The environment changed, but the state didn't. This is why consciousness creates reality, feels confronting at first. It removes excuses. If life keeps repeating patterns, it's not punishment. It's feedback from the same inner position being occupied again and again. Neville used to explain that states are like rooms in a house. You don't improve the furniture in one room and expect to experience another. You have to actually move. When people talk about change consciousness Neville Goddard style, they're talking about leaving one room entirely. Not fixing lack, but exiting it. Not improving struggle, but stepping into a different assumption. Most people try to fix their lives the way they rearrange a messy desk, moving things around, hoping clarity appears. But a new life doesn't emerge from better organization. It emerges from a different identity. That's why the Lei da Assunção isn't about effort. It's about what feels natural to you when no one is watching. There's a familiar moment many recognize: reading something inspiring, feeling hopeful for a few hours, then slipping back into old reactions. That's not failure. It's gravity pulling you back to the same state. A state feels like me, even when it hurts. And until a new state feels safer than the old one, the mind keeps returning home. A wise mentor would remind you that states don't change through force, they change through understanding. When you see that your current experience is not personal, but mechanical, something softens. You stop blaming yourself and start observing the pattern. That observation alone begins the shift your old consciousness couldn't sustain. Neville Goddard emphasized that the outer world is dead without your awareness animating it. When awareness changes, the animation changes. This is why two people can live in the same city, same economy, same family, and experience completely different lives. They're not in the same state, even if the scenery looks identical. Think of someone who always gets lucky. What you're seeing isn't luck, it's congruence. Their inner assumption allows good things to feel normal, so life reflects that ease. This is the lived meaning behind Shift Your State Neville taught. Stop trying to earn a better life and start occupying it internally. At first, this idea can feel unfair. People think, so it's all on me. But the relief comes when you realize it's also all available to you. You don't have to wait for permission, timing, or approval. A state is entered instantly the moment it feels true. The moment consciousness moves even slightly, life begins responding in ways that don't make sense logically. Small changes in reaction, subtle emotional lightness, a different inner dialogue. Nothing dramatic yet, but something has loosened. And that's usually when the next question naturally arises. If states create life, how exactly does one remain stuck in the same one for so long? Neville taught that consciousness is the only reality, not as a philosophy, but as a practical law you can observe daily. A mentor would invite you to notice how your life feels predictable in certain areas, almost scripted. That script isn't written by fate or society, it's written by what you consistently assume is true about yourself. Those assumptions quietly become the framework of your life. Most people believe assumptions are thoughts, but Neville Goddard clarified that assumptions are states you live from. A thought can pass in seconds, a state lingers for years. When someone says, "This always happens to me," they're not complaining, they're revealing the state they occupy. And the world, faithful and obedient, reflects it back without argument. This is why the law of assumption explained deeply is both liberating and uncomfortable. It means life isn't random, but it also means there's no one else to blame. The economy, family, and past experiences may influence you, but they don't decide for you. Consciousness decides first, then life follows. Think about childhood phrases you heard repeatedly. Money doesn't grow on trees. Life is hard, or you have to suffer to deserve. Those weren't facts. They were assumptions passed down like heirlooms. Without realizing it, many people accept them as personal truths. Over time, those borrowed ideas solidify into lived reality. Neville Goddard often reminded students that the world is a mirror, not a judge. It doesn't reward or punish, it reflects. When you assume lack, life mirrors scarcity. When you assume fulfillment, life reorganizes to confirm it. This is the quiet power behind a imaginação cria a realidade, even when imagination is unconscious. A mentor might share how, at one point, he kept waiting for life to change. Only later did he realize waiting itself was an assumption, that good things were always in the future. The moment he assumed that fulfillment was now, opportunities began showing up in ordinary, almost boring ways. No magic, just alignment. This explains why two people can visualize the same outcome and get different results. One is imagining from desire, the other from identity. Neville Goddard insisted that imagining as the person who already is brings results, while imagining as the person who once keeps life stuck. That difference is subtle but decisive. Assumptions reveal themselves through emotional reflexes. How you react to a bill, a message, or silence tells you more than affirmations ever could. If tension appears instantly, the assumption is still active. Changing consciousness means allowing a new reaction to feel natural, even before evidence appears. People often ask how long it takes for assumptions to harden into reality. The honest answer is, it depends on how natural they feel. What feels natural solidifies quickly. What feels forced collapses under pressure. That's why Neville emphasized faithfulness to the state, not constant mental effort. Once this clicks, life stops feeling hostile and starts feeling instructional. Every repeated pattern becomes a message pointing back to consciousness. And once you see that message clearly, another realization begins to surface. If assumptions shape life so precisely, what happens when someone tries to change results without changing who they believe they are? The most common mistake people make is trying to change outcomes while keeping the same inner identity. A mentor would gently point out that this is like planting new seeds in old soil and expecting a different harvest. Neville Goddard made it clear that a new life cannot grow from an old state. The state always determines what is allowed to appear. Many people say they want abundance, love, or freedom, yet still see themselves as someone who struggles, waits, or sacrifices. That contradiction creates frustration. The outer desire pulls forward, while the inner identity pulls back. This inner tug-of-war explains why effort feels exhausting and results feel inconsistent. Neville Goddard often spoke about identity without using modern labels. He described it as the "I am" you fall asleep as. That quiet self-definition shapes tomorrow without asking for permission. When the identity remains unchanged, the day simply rearranges itself to confirm the familiar story. Think of someone who changes jobs but keeps feeling undervalued. Or someone who moves cities yet feels just as stuck. The scenery shifts, but the state travels with them. This is why Shift Your State, Neville emphasized, is not optional, it's foundational. Life doesn't respond to movement, it responds to being. A mentor might share how he once chased better results while secretly believing success was temporary. Every win felt fragile. The moment he noticed that belief, he stopped managing outcomes and started redefining himself as someone for whom stability was normal. Results followed quietly, without struggle. The Lei Da Sun Sao isn't asking you to deny your current experience. It asks you to stop identifying with it. There's a difference between noticing where you are and declaring who you are. One is observation, the other is self-definition. Neville Goddard warned that confusing the two keeps people trapped. This is why affirmations fail when they contradict identity. Saying "I am wealthy" while feeling like an outsider to wealth creates inner resistance, but assuming "this is becoming normal for me" softens the transition. Identity shifts gently, not violently. A useful question a mentor might offer is, who am I being right now that makes this result logical? That question removes emotion and invites clarity. It stops self-blame and starts self-awareness. And awareness is the doorway to a new state. When identity begins to loosen, something interesting happens. Old reactions feel slightly foreign. Old fears don't grip as tightly. You're not fully in the new state yet, but you're no longer anchored to the old one. That in-between space can feel uncomfortable, but it's also creative. This is usually when people feel tempted to rush results for reassurance. But Neville Goddard insisted that identity must change first, then expression follows. And as that truth settles in, another layer becomes visible. When consciousness shifts, perception itself begins to change. When consciousness changes, perception changes automatically, without effort or force. A mentor would explain that you don't suddenly get a new world. You get new eyes. Neville Goddard taught that reality was always offering possibilities, but the old state simply couldn't perceive them. What you call luck is often just perception, finally aligned with a new assumption. Think about how in a low state, advice sounds annoying and opportunities feel suspicious. Yet in a different state, the same information feels useful, even obvious. Nothing outside changed, only the filter through which life was being interpreted. This is one of the clearest demonstrations that consciousness creates reality at the perceptual level first. Neville Goddard described this as the rearrangement of meaning. Events don't change immediately, but their interpretation does. A delay feels neutral instead of threatening. A challenge feels like feedback instead of rejection. That subtle shift in meaning is evidence that the state has already moved. A mentor might share how, after shifting internally, he started noticing invitations, conversations, and ideas that had always been there. They didn't appear magically, they became visible. This is why people often say, it came out of nowhere, when in truth, it came out of alignment. This is also where many underestimate the power of imagination. A imaginação cria a realidade, not by inventing fantasy, but by tuning perception. When imagination changes, attention follows. And what you consistently notice begins to grow in importance and frequency. Old consciousness sees walls, new consciousness sees doors, not because doors were built overnight, but because the mind stopped labeling them as impossible. Neville Goddard insisted that perception is an extension of assumption. You don't see what you want, you see what you assume is available. This explains why advice from others suddenly makes sense at a certain point in life. You heard it before, but you couldn't receive it. Reception requires readiness, not intelligence. When the state shifts, insight feels simple instead of overwhelming. A practical way a mentor might describe this is through reading. You can read the same book at different times and walk away with completely different lessons. The words didn't change, you did. Consciousness determines what is extracted from experience. As perception changes, decision-making becomes lighter. You don't overthink as much because fewer options feel threatening. Life starts to feel cooperative instead of adversarial. This is a quiet but powerful confirmation that Shift Your State Neville taught is already underway. And once perception begins opening like this, a natural curiosity arises. If the world looks different now, how does one intentionally step into the state where the desire already feels done, not imagined, but lived? Neville invited people into a simple but uncomfortable question. Who would I be if this desire were already fulfilled? A mentor would pause here, because this question isn't intellectual, it's experiential. Most people answer with words, but Neville Goddard was pointing to a state of awareness. The answer is felt, not explained. At first, the mind tries to negotiate. It says, I'd be happier when it happens, or I'd relax once I see proof. But the wish-fulfilled Neville method reverses that order. It asks you to relax first, to feel normal now, without waiting for permission from circumstances. That's where resistance usually shows up. Neville Goddard emphasized that fulfillment feels surprisingly ordinary. Not euphoric, not dramatic, just settled. A mentor might explain that when something is truly yours, you don't obsess over it. You assume it. The feeling is closer to relief than excitement, closer to calm than adrenaline. Think of how you feel about your name or your age. You don't celebrate them daily. You accept them as facts. That's the quality of feeling Neville was pointing to when he said, sentir é o segredo. The goal is to let the desire feel as natural as something you no longer question. Many people try to visualize harder instead of being softer. They strain the imagination, hoping intensity will replace embodiment. But feeling it real, Neville Goddard taught, was never about force. It was about allowing the inner posture of someone for whom the desire is already integrated. A mentor might suggest a small grounded practice. Sit quietly and ask, if this were done, what tension would disappear? Then notice the body's response. Maybe the shoulders drop, the breath deepens, the jaw relaxes. That physical shift is more valuable than 1,000 affirmations. This is where Viva no Fim becomes practical, not mystical. Living from the end doesn't mean pretending all day. It means returning again and again to the internal neutrality of fulfillment. The end feels stable, not desperate. Neville Goddard warned that impatience is a sign the state hasn't been assumed yet. Wanting reassurance means the old identity is still speaking. The fulfilled state doesn't ask, is it working? It simply lives. And learning to rest there is a skill developed gently, not instantly. At first, the new awareness may feel unfamiliar, almost boring. The drama of wanting is gone, and the mind misses it. But boredom is often the doorway to embodiment. When desire stops screaming, it starts shaping reality. And once that feeling of normalcy settles in, even briefly, another realization emerges. The body itself begins signaling when the shift is real, long before the world shows any evidence. Neville Goddard taught that feeling is the evidence of transformation, not the reward. A mentor would clarify that this feeling isn't excitement or constant positivity. It's relief, peace, and a quiet confidence that doesn't need explanation. When the new consciousness is accepted, the nervous system reflects it immediately. Many people think transformation should feel intense, like a breakthrough moment. But in practice, the opposite is often true. When a state truly changes, urgency disappears. The inner pressure to make it happen fades, and what remains is a subtle sense of being supported. This is why sentir é o segredo is so often misunderstood. It's not about manufacturing emotion, it's about recognizing emotional neutrality. The fulfilled state feels settled, as if the mind has stopped arguing with life. That calm is a stronger indicator than excitement ever could be. A mentor might point out that anxiety is a sign of divided consciousness. Part of you is still waiting, still watching for proof. When the state is assumed, attention returns to the present moment. You're no longer scanning reality for confirmation, because internally the decision is already made. Neville Goddard explained that the body accepts states before the intellect does. That's why physical cues matter. Easier breathing, relaxed posture, slower thoughts. These are not coincidences. They're the body agreeing with a new assumption. Think about moments in your life when something finally clicked. The stress didn't increase, it dissolved. That dissolution is what signals alignment. The new consciousness doesn't announce itself loudly, it whispers through comfort and ease. This is also why forcing positivity backfires. Pretending to feel good while the body feels tense creates inner conflict. Neville never taught denial. He taught acceptance of a new reality so complete that tension becomes unnecessary. A mentor might suggest noticing how you respond to triggers now. Does a bill still create panic or just practicality? Does silence still feel like rejection or simply space? These emotional shifts are milestones, even if nothing visible has changed yet. The moment you feel less reactive, you've already moved. Life hasn't caught up, but consciousness has, and Neville Goddard insisted that consciousness always leads. The outer world is faithful, but slow. Once this feeling stabilizes, even briefly, a new challenge appears, not external, but internal. What happens when reality hasn't changed yet, but the feeling has? That's where most people are tempted to doubt the shift itself. When outer reality lags behind, Neville Goddard warned against interpreting delay as failure. A mentor would explain that the visible world always follows the invisible change with a delay, just like a shadow follows a body. Consciousness moves first. Matter rearranges second. Expecting immediate proof misunderstands the order of creation. Most people are conditioned to believe that seeing is believing. Neville reversed this. Believing is seeing. The moment you look to the outside for reassurance, you step back into the old state. That's why patience isn't passive, it's loyalty to the new assumption. Think of planting a seed. Digging it up daily doesn't make it grow faster. It interrupts the process. In the same way, constantly checking reality for confirmation weakens embodiment. The wish-fulfilled Neville method requires trust during the silent phase. A mentor might share how, after an internal shift, life seemed strangely quiet. No dramatic signs, no fireworks, just stillness. That stillness often makes people nervous because they're used to struggle as proof of progress. But stillness is often a sign that the state has stabilized. Neville Goddard emphasized that doubt is not a moral failure, it's a signal of attachment to appearances. The moment you feel anxious about timing, it's an invitation to return to the feeling of completion. The end is not ahead, it's the position you occupy now. This is where Viva no Fim becomes a discipline, not a forced belief, but a consistent inner posture. You live as someone who knows, not someone who hopes. That knowing is quiet and doesn't argue with circumstances. Outer delay also serves a purpose. It gives the new state time to deepen. If results appeared instantly, identity might not have time to adjust. The gap allows consciousness to become the default, not a temporary experience. A mentor would encourage noticing how much less reactive you already are. That emotional distance is proof that the shift is real. Life hasn't arrived yet because it's still reorganizing around your new position. Neville Goddard taught that impatience collapses states, not because it's wrong, but because it returns attention to lack. Remaining faithful to the unseen is what allows the unseen to become seen. Faith in this sense is fidelity to feeling, and as this fidelity continues, something subtle begins to happen again. Small signs start appearing, not as confirmation, but as echoes. That's usually when people notice the earliest external reflections of an internal change. Neville Goddard described early signs of transformation as changes in reaction before changes in circumstance. A mentor would say that life whispers before it speaks. These whispers show up as lighter emotions, softer responses, and moments where old triggers no longer hook you the same way. One of the first signs is emotional spaciousness. Situations that once felt heavy now feel manageable. You're not forcing positivity, you simply have more room inside. This is a clear indication that consciousness creates reality from the inside out. Another sign is different reactions from people. Conversations shift. Others respond with more ease, respect, or openness, even though you haven't changed your behavior intentionally. Neville Goddard taught that people reflect states, not personalities. When the state changes, relationships adjust automatically. Synchronicities also begin appearing, small ordinary coincidences that feel meaningful. A book is mentioned twice in one day. An idea resurfaces unexpectedly. These aren't miracles, they're alignments. They show that perception is now tuned to a different frequency of experience. A mentor might share how, after shifting internally, opportunities seemed to find him. In reality, he was finally in the state that could notice and accept them. This is how a imaginação cria a realidade, by reorganizing attention before reorganizing events. Another early sign is reduced urgency. You're still moving forward, but without pressure. Decisions feel clearer, and overthinking decreases. This calm decisiveness is not passivity, it's coherence between desire and identity. People often overlook these signs because they're subtle. They expect fireworks, not gentleness. But Neville Goddard insisted that the most powerful changes feel natural. The louder the internal effort, the weaker the state. A mentor would advise honoring these early shifts instead of dismissing them. They're the scaffolding of the new reality. Ignoring them often leads people to abandon the state too soon, right before embodiment stabilizes. As these signs accumulate, confidence grows, not the loud kind, but the quiet kind. You begin trusting your inner position more than external noise. The old need for validation fades, and when these changes become consistent, something deeper occurs. The new state stops feeling temporary. It begins to feel like who you are, not something you're practicing. That's when true embodiment quietly takes over. Deep embodiment happens when the new consciousness becomes your default, not something you have to remember or manage. A mentor would explain that this is the moment when effort dissolves. You're no longer reminding yourself to think differently. You simply are different. The state has settled in like a new home. At this stage, life feels less like a project and more like a flow. You stop micromanaging outcomes because there's nothing to fix. Neville Goddard described this as living from the end so naturally that desire no longer feels separate from you. The mind rests because it trusts the position it's standing in. One of the clearest signs of embodiment is the absence of inner dialogue about results. You're not asking, is it working? Because that question belongs to the old identity. The new consciousness doesn't seek confirmation, it operates from assumption. This is the lived expression of the lei d'assunção. A mentor might compare it to learning to drive. At first, everything is conscious and effortful. Later, you drive while thinking about something else entirely. The skill didn't disappear, it integrated. That's how a state becomes embodied, through repetition until it becomes unconscious. Neville Goddard emphasized that this is when reality starts responding more fluidly, not necessarily faster, but with less resistance. Events unfold without drama, because there's no internal conflict pulling against them. The outer world mirrors the inner coherence. People often fear this stage because it feels too normal. They expect transformation to feel extraordinary. But normalcy is power. What feels normal is what persists. This is why feeling it real, Neville Goddard taught, was always about naturalness, not intensity. In deep embodiment, reactions are chosen, not reflexive. You respond instead of react. Old emotional habits lose their grip because they're no longer fed by identity. The nervous system has learned a new baseline. A mentor would gently warn against testing reality at this point. Testing implies doubt. Embodiment thrives on trust. The less you check, the more life confirms. This is the paradox most people miss. As this state stabilizes, you may notice that you're no longer doing manifestation. You're living. Desires arise and dissolve naturally, without urgency. That's when Viva no Fim stops being a technique and becomes a way of being. And once this becomes familiar, a final truth quietly reveals itself. When consciousness changes and remains faithful to itself, life has no choice but to transform completely around it. When your consciousness changes, your life transforms, not as a reward, but as a consequence. A mentor would explain that reality isn't persuaded or convinced, it simply complies. Neville Goddard taught that the world is obedient to consciousness, responding faithfully to the state you consistently occupy. Change the state, and life reorganizes itself without negotiation. Most people wait for motivation to remain faithful to a new identity. But faithfulness in Neville's sense isn't emotional intensity, it's consistency. It's choosing the same inner position again and again, especially when the outer world hasn't caught up yet. That quiet loyalty is what stabilizes transformation. This is where the law of assumption explained becomes practical. You assume the state the way you assume your name, without effort, without debate. The assumption doesn't argue with evidence, it outlives it. Over time, evidence has no option but to align. A mentor might remind you that consciousness doesn't respond to what you occasionally touch, it responds to where you live. Visiting a new state briefly inspires you, but remaining there reshapes you. Neville Goddard insisted that permanence, not perfection, is what creates results. Choosing the state deliberately doesn't mean suppressing emotions. It means recognizing that emotions pass, but identity stays. You don't abandon the state because of a bad day, just as you don't change your name because of a bad mood. This emotional maturity is part of embodiment. As this steadiness develops, decision-making becomes simpler. You choose from alignment, not fear. Actions feel obvious instead of forced. Life starts meeting you halfway because there's no longer inner resistance canceling movement. A mentor would point out that effort decreases as authority increases. When you know who you are being, you stop asking life for permission. You move calmly, speak clearly, and expect cooperation, not because you demand it, but because it feels normal. This is the lived meaning of change consciousness Neville Goddard emphasized throughout his teachings. You're no longer reacting to the world reacts to you. And even challenges arrive differently, less personal, more instructional. Over time, people notice your presence before your words. Something feels settled about you. That's not confidence learned from success. It's confidence rooted in identity. Consciousness has taken the lead, and life is following its cue. Neville Goddard often said that the end is where creation begins. When you remain faithful to the chosen state, creation doesn't strain, it unfolds. Reality reshapes itself quietly, efficiently, and often in ways you couldn't have planned. And as this becomes clear, one final understanding settles in gently. This was never about changing the world at all. It was about choosing who you would be and allowing the world to catch up. Now, the real question isn't whether this works, it's how long you'll keep living from the same state once you see this. If consciousness creates reality, what state have you been loyal to without noticing? And more importantly, what would change if you chose differently, starting today? Take a moment and ask yourself honestly, who am I being when no one is watching? What feels normal to you, like struggle, waiting, effort, or calm expectation and quiet trust? Because the life you're living right now is not a coincidence. It's a reflection of the state you've been occupying. You don't need to force belief or control every thought. The invitation is simpler and deeper. Choose the state that feels like the end already fulfilled and return to it gently again and again. Let relief replace urgency. Let identity lead action. Let reality catch up in its own time. So tonight, tomorrow, and in the small moments that usually go unnoticed, pay attention. Notice how you react. Notice what you assume. Notice where you return internally. That's where transformation actually happens. If this message resonated with you and you want to keep deepening your understanding of Neville Goddard, the law of assumption, and how to live from the end in a grounded, practical way, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Stay close to these teachings, not as ideas but as a way of being.